It was in a previous video that I mentioned that at some point during the year 2023, I abandoned this project. That abandonment was for its own benefit. It was to shield it from the suffering it may endure from my lack of focus, because my attention was elsewhere. After an almost 2-year stasis, I recommenced the project on Friday the 7th of March 2025 at approximately 5:25 p.m. It was only days before this footage was filmed that I sealed the substructure of the base with 2 coats of hard wax oil. It was on one of the days that preceded this one, and due to my modest budget, I made the choice to use hard wax oil because that's all I had on hand at that very moment. It was also within this moment I welcomed a realization. That realization was delivered after an industrious summer, and the season's end was rapidly approaching. As the summer's end drew near, an opportunity to re-engage with this project presented itself, and I was pleased. Anyway, after quite a period of time had passed, I could finally and permanently attach the legs to the base of the table. Although the curved sections of the legs that present themselves on each corner are made from one solid piece of timber, what's behind the legs is a story of material maximization. The legs' innards are made up of several sections of timber that were carefully harvested from multiple offcuts. These offcuts were then combined to form a very solid set of legs. As in the case of the hard wax oil, this Frankenstein approach to making components also suited my budget. The aim of the following scene is to allude to a premonition I had back in 2023. This scene portrays me from the past giving me of the present a stack of uniformly dimensioned timber. Now that this paradoxical exchange has occurred, I can take this timber and rip out all the tongues to line the trenches that were formed back in 2023 in preparation for this very moment. After this, I can move on to preparing the cladding for the table's base. A repetitious task such as drilling multiple fixing holes is best addressed with carefully positioned registration to ensure consistent placement of multiple countersunk holes. Pre-drilling all the components that will make up the cladded surfaces of the table's base is a personal and optional operational choice. Stop, and now it's time for a viewer favourite, sanding. There's a technique I never fail to use when it comes to sanding, but I refuse to share that technique. You'll just have to use your imagination. The table's base is the result of the amalgamation of over 200 separate components that will ultimately lead to the base's mass and presence. The more than 200 parts combined make the base's main structure. However, that figure doesn't include the housing for the electrical hardware or the additions that'll be revealed later in this video. At the beginning of part 2 of this series, I used melamine tape to produce a record of the measurement required. That measurement can now be transferred to this piece of aluminium right angle, and I'm hoping these markings will become self-evident as I move forward. If I can avoid getting down on my knees, I will. However, from time to time a situation presents itself to test my mettle. To me, there is no need for a test because my commitment to the spark that ignited this project is beyond doubt, which I believe is currently on display. At least, that's what I tell myself. But in this particular moment, I really questioned what was compelling me to get down on my knees. Once the cladding was placed on the curvaceous dictatorial edges of the base's substructure, my ability to drill holes perpendicular to that surface would have been compromised if it wasn't for the guidance of the pre-drilled holes. Otherwise, I would have been presented with multiple challenges when navigating the undulating terrain. As the last spline, or keystone, along with some glue, is carefully slid into position, locking the fortification altogether, I realise the race against time is over and I can relax. Now I can head around the back and continue the lockdown. And relax. Momentarily. Off camera, I made two different and very rudimentary templates. I chose cardboard for this task due to its flexible and forgiving nature. It was important to me to get the scale and feel of the sweeping curvature just right, rather than concentrating on having perfect curves. That'll come later as I refine the underbelly of the table's base. As I'm nearing the end of awkwardly removing excess material, I welcome the opportunity to dismount and move down to the ground level of the table's base. From there, I can really dial in the design of what will be the table's primary weight bearers. But first, a reflective thought. Whenever I have an encounter with a handsaw, there are visions and thoughts that instantly enter my mind. One of my earliest memories of using hand tools is the time my grandfather patiently showed me how to use a handsaw. He taught me to use the whole blade, take my time and never force it. Let the blade do the cutting. These are the memories that flood my mind every time I pick up a handsaw, especially a panel saw. After this display, it wouldn't surprise me if I was haunted by the presence of a disappointed grandfather. This task may be a little beyond my skill level and best handed over to a skilled orthopaedic surgeon with the requisite light touch. But that surgeon wouldn't have an image in mind that matches my vision for these feet, so I'll have to perform the operation without qualification. The word butcher comes to mind. Okay, I've roughed in the basic shape of the feet and for now I'm satisfied. I'll perform the pedicure later. Now my attention is focused on the valley between the four weight-bearing peaks. Okay, back to the feet. Now that I've crudely applied the basic shape using the power of electricity, I can now turn to a less traumatic frenzied attack and swap it for a calmer, delicate approach. As I age, I find the calming effects of using hand tools has gained in its appeal. I know it looks like I'm not concentrating on one area, but as we all know, looks can be deceptive. I have a lot of ground to cover, and due to the dream-inspired design being in my head, to make sure that I do that vision justice, I move back and forth between areas that require attention to holistically bring the design of the base into its final form. As you can see, the vision that compelled this project requires a lot of sanding. It also requires a lot of shaping and other forms of timber manipulation. Eventually, I retired the belt sander. Then I performed a pivotal move back to the feet to break out the hand tools again. It was there I was confronted with an inspiring presence. Okay, anyway, shaping the feet for the base required me to deploy a series of methods to really dial in and refine the final shape. Finally. Sometimes a custom tool is called into existence. I'd like to present my weapon of choice. This is a piece of 50mm dowel impregnated with 2 pieces of 20mm dowel for handles, then wrapped with a section of 36 grit abrasive taken from a discarded belt sander belt. Once I was happy with the overall shape that had emerged after all that busy work, I thought I'd add a little more detail. I wasn't happy with how the underbelly's crude edges were exposed, so I thought I'd remove the unappealing sections and ease the transition to the belly's underside.
Focus here.
Now that all that shaping is done, it's time for me to challenge the strength of my conviction to this project. I'm really committed to the ideas that have been presenting themselves in my mind's eye throughout this project. But when it came to cutting into the work that I'd just completed, I hesitated, momentarily. Then I cut the holes into the sides. After doing so, I was relieved to find that all the interlocking cladding I'd installed worked according to plan. It had formed a substantial mass capable of withstanding large portions of it being removed. Although this was an ideal integrity test for this fortification, this operation had momentarily weakened the structure. For now, it'll remain compromised and exposed until it's fitted with customised circular armoured plates, which will feature in the next instalment of this project series. Again, off camera I made this router guide and installed the router with the appropriate bearing guided flush trimming bit, this guy. If I ensure all the holes are the same diameter, then it makes filling the holes clean and easy. This bit's not so clean and easy, but necessary if I'm to fit in the recessed lighting. This is not the first time I've created plywood tubes for this project. The first two I made are a little different and are positioned just beneath the table's top. When finished, these cylinders will form 6 recesses to house the LED lights that will illuminate the table's base. I'll go into a little more detail on this subject in the next episode of this series. With the fit of the lighting cylinders confirmed, I can move on to fine-tuning the depth of the recesses. To do this, I've equipped the cylinders with an anti-rotation device, because when cutting barrel-like structures on the bandsaw, it's safer with the right kind of improvised equipment. Off camera, I glued some timber together to make boards big enough to accommodate the discs that will feature a unique web design. I say it's unique only because it was hand-drawn. Now, while I prepare the materials, I'll explain the origins of what inspired this particular design feature. First, I'm going to confirm that I have ample material to accommodate the diameter of the discs that'll contain the design. This design was taken from the original template I made that was used to generate the aluminium shapes housed within the recessed lighting on the table's top. Creating objects of this type reminds me of when I used to play music on stage, which gave me the opportunity to observe stage lighting. One object I observed while on stage was a plate with a stencil design on it that was placed in front of a stage light. When that light was turned on, the emitting light then projected the design onto any surface. Anyway, that's the origin story of this design, and I believe it's known as a gobo.
Focus.
When repeatedly using one template to create organic-looking features, one of the main issues I have is the more it's duplicated, the greater the chances are of the shapes taking on a generic look rather than maintaining distinct individual qualities. To my eye, it's clearly obvious when a CNC machine has been used. Not that I've got anything against CNC machines, so in order to achieve a more organic result, I make a few subtle adjustments, which I'm about to explain from the workshop. For this, I'm not going to let the grain dictate the orientation of the pattern. Every time I move this pattern, I'm going to twist it slightly, so the grain will always run vertically, but the pattern differs slightly from the last patterns, so they don't all look identical when you see all 3 of them together. So we'll just do something like that, and away I go, tracing it out. Yeah, you may have noticed I'm using a white marker now. I raided my daughter's art supplies, found this, works quite well. Now it's also a good idea to flip it over and repeat. Yeah, I know. A CNC machine would be a lot easier, but I like a challenge. Maybe one day it'll happen. Anyway, earlier I explained the origin story of this design. My intention for doing that was to deliver my reasoning for what I'm doing here. At this stage of the build, my aim was to transmit the gobo's design throughout the table's base, echoing its duplicates as they are projected out of 6 diffused portholes.
Focus.
This is one of those times I'm very glad to be able to almost synchronize the use of 2 router tables. Efficiently moving a short distance from one router table to the other instead of making multiple tool changes, I believe these dual router tables dramatically reduce the time spent on what would otherwise be a time-consuming operation. The destiny of this project is known, but the journey remains obscured. That's why my initial sketches lack complete details. They're mostly a symbolic, undefined sketch of an idea on paper. Or MDF. It's only after beginning the voyage that the fog begins to clear and the destination reveals itself as each component manifests. When the details within those manifested components are revealed, it's the definition within that revelation that signals the completion of that portion of the journey. And that brings me to the end of this portion of the journey. Thanks for joining me.